like to thank you all for being with us tonight. I'd like to welcome you all. And first of all, I would like to begin with a thank you to some of our sponsors. The first one is our sponsor, M&T Bank, who are sponsoring this event tonight. And especially to thank them because they have made a very generous grant to the council, sponsoring our speaker programs for the entire year. We're especially grateful to Jamie Kelly, who is the Senior Vice President for Commercial Lending for M&T, who has been a relentless advocate and supporter of the council and our mission. It's just terrific to have someone like this who is such a strong supporter. I'd like to thank Board Member Stephanie Marr, who is providing tech support for tonight's meeting. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Arthur House. Mr. House became Chief Cybersecurity Risk Officer for the state of Connecticut in October of 2016, after 4 years as Chairman of Connecticut's Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. He has an extensive background in national security. For example, he served as Director of Communications in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. He also served as Chief of the Communications Group for the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, a combat support agency of the U.S. Department of Defense. I can say I remember exactly, probably in 1987, the first time I got to use a product from that agency. It's incredible what those people do. It stunned me then, and it was a significant moment, and I still remember it. Mr. House has been a White House Fellow, and he served as a Special Projects Officer on the staff of the National Security Council. He is also a member of the Board of Directors of our sister council in Hartford, the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. He will be speaking to us tonight about the liberal international order, worth preserving. As he speaks, I urge you to think of questions you might ask him. When we come back, and I'll moderate the questions. And I ask you, as you think of your questions, try to think of questions that start with the words who, what, why, how, please explain, please describe, rather than the word I. So without further ado, Mr. House, thank you. And I think if we could ask everybody to black their faces out, and we'll just let Mr. House have the floor.
Well, it's good to see you all. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate the introduction. My talk today is going to be a micro talk, looking at the bigger picture. Sometimes World Affairs Councils, we talk about things like specific situations, such as Putin or what's going on in China or the war in the Middle East or whatever it happens to be. I thought today I would look back at the larger macro picture, because after all, that's what the World Affairs Councils were created to do. They all started cropping up in the 1920s in order to combat isolationism and to support a positive role of the United States in the world and to understand foreign affairs. So the liberal international rules-based order is a long title for the international security economic system that we created after World War II. And it served us well. It's been a good system, but it's old and it needs revision. And at the same time, we see in very stark relief, the dangers of autocratic countries who do not buy into this order, especially Russia, especially China. We do not want to live in their world order, and I'll explain why. Let me just ask a question to all of you. How do you look at history? Is it basically a pattern of normalcy or peace that gets in other words, peace is normal? And that's what it's like, but it gets interrupted every so often by war. Or it's the other way around, as a professor named Christian Podholm at Bowdoin University suggests that we could also look at the world as normally a time of war, which is interspersed every so often by periods of peace. You could argue that either way. And fortunately, since 1948, the creation of this order, we have basically been without major world power wars. But that is a fleeting situation if you look at world history. If we look at this from the second perspective, that history is basically a period of wars, then we have to ask, what causes peace? What causes stability? And periods of stability tend to occur when there's a dominant power, such as the Mongolian dynasty or the British Empire. And instability in warfare come when there is more than one center of power, especially when there's disagreement regarding the rules of governance. Now, conflict and war have been constants in human history. As nations gain and lose power, or the will, they have it and they lose the will to use it, we're apt to see change and instability and violence. The stronger nations, if they lead, define the world order. The better they are at managing it, the less chance for war. Now, for Americans, for most of our history, the Monroe Doctrine was our guiding policy. We'll take care of the Western Hemisphere, Latin America and North America, and we ask everybody else to stay out. And wars basically were things that took place in Europe or Asia, and we enjoyed that isolationism. On August 18th, 1914, as World War I was unfolding, President Woodrow Wilson signed a proclamation of neutrality to keep the United States out of the war. For all of our history, we had avoided world wars. They happened over there somewhere else. And obviously, his proclamation of neutrality didn't work. Why? Because we cared about what happened to Western civilization in Europe, because of our size and of our power. Eventually, we entered, but we largely saw it as a temporary engagement, an aberration. That was something to be fought over there. I don't know, you're too young to remember the song, but the Yanks are coming, as the song went, and we won't come back until it's over there. Wars were something outside of the United States. When it was over, World War I ended, we resisted leadership. Even though we'd helped design the League of Nations, isolationism stayed very strong. We believed in America first. We declined to join the League of Nations, and we wanted to stay out of other people's business. Other people's business is another term for what goes on in the world. In 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain said that we surely had bigger things to worry about than, here's the quote, than a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. He was referring to Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. And we know what happened. And then on September 5, 1939, 4 days after Germany invaded Poland, President Roosevelt quickly issued a proclamation declaring U.S. neutrality, as Wilson had in World War I. It took Germany conquering most of Europe and the prospect of defeating the United Kingdom and the bombing of Pearl Harbor to bring us into the war that we eventually won at huge cost. World War II changed forever how Americans looked at our role in the world. It was a complete change. We had no plan about what we would do when it was over. We were the major power with a relatively strong economy. We were the surviving powerful armed force. International responsibility and our own self-interest demanded that we engage in creating the kind of world we wanted to live in. We could not prosper alone unless, in a post-war setting that saw Europe and Japan not being rebuilt unless we led the way. So we won, and we saw that we could not retreat into Fortress America. So the United States set about creating the structures, the institutions, the rules that most of the world lives by today, which has been called the liberal international rules-based order. And what is it? Well, it provided a forum for all nations to raise issues, air grievances, and provide collective security through the United Nations. It brought urgently needed monetary stability through the International Monetary Fund. And it brought investment to rebuild Europe, then the Third World through the World Bank. It launched the Marshall Plan to rebuild after the ravages of war. It established rules for international trade. It protected international property and patents. It called for the respect of human rights, women's rights, and the protection of civilians in wartime through the Geneva Convention. It established alliances such as NATO, protect all of its members. Now, U.S. businesses had greater reason to invest and trade because this order reinforced predictability, relative stability, and a sense of order. There are challenges to it. Not everybody bought into this, obviously. Smaller powers in the colonized world we're not full partners. Countries such as Russia, China, Iran, North Korea have rejected this international order and U.S. leadership of it. Two major powers, China and Russia, pose strategic challenges that we need to take seriously. They met just last week and reaffirmed the fact that they do not buy into the international order led by the United States. And we have a basic challenge. Can we bring China and Russia into the existing order? And if we cannot, can we manage our differences sufficiently to avoid conflict and war with them? We do not have an answer to that. Today, China sees no obligation to obey international rules and systems that it had no role in creating. It has ridden the fundamental contradiction of encouraging economic entrepreneurship on the one hand, economic liberty, while tightly controlling political behavior of its population. Can that exist? Can you be free economically and dominated politically? We don't have the answer to that. But consider 2 points: the social index number and artificial intelligence. Now, the social index number, every Chinese citizen is given a number. And that number gives you a score. It can be enhanced by good behavior and adherence to the preferences of the Communist Party, and it can be assigned a low score for nonconformity. If you have dangerous ties with foreigners, if you talk to journalists, if you support dissent, or even if you have a relative who is a problem maker, then you'll be given a low number. And what happens if you get a low number? Bad job prospects. You may not get into a university, or your children may not get into a university. You may not get a mortgage, an apartment, and it can seriously affect the quality of life. So that is what the totalitarian system envisioned in Brave New World in 1984. What would the world look like if you can control human behavior? China is trying to do that. It uses artificial intelligence to identify its citizens by facial recognition, iris, by body scanners, your gait, how you walk, your voice. There are 500 million cameras in China tracking behavior. They're not hidden. They don't want them to be hidden. They're on street corners, in banks, malls, hotels, gas stations. China wants its citizens to know that they're being watched, they're being monitored, they're being evaluated and given a social index score. Now, China has introduced aspects of this surveillance program to 80 countries. They can control human behavior in China far beyond what humans can do because of that artificial intelligence. It enables the crushing of individual freedom. Just a word about Russia. Has consistently seen the West as its main enemy. It did not join many of the Western post-war organizations. It created its own alliance system, and it suffered the collapse of the Soviet Union and its economy. Today, despite having an economy about the size of Italy's, Russia continues to project itself aggressively, some would say with paranoia, and by brutal authoritarian rule. It rules by fear. It represses its population. Dissidents, as we've seen with Navalny and scores of others, risk prison or being killed. Conscripts are sent to battle with rear guard forces who are there to shoot them if they seek to retreat or to escape. You know, it's very interesting. On the desk behind Putin in his office is not a bust of Lenin or Stalin, but of Peter the Great. His view is of Russian predominance, the Russian Empire. And that, of course, clashes with the existing international order that we help to manage. His behavior has strengthened NATO's resistance because for him, the West is the enemy, as he likes to say. Now, the second challenge to the international liberal order is our own, here in the United States, our own domestic aversion to foreign entanglement. We've had a recent president who inherited this valuable system and tried to repeal it, but he didn't have a system to repeal it. So he didn't like it, but he didn't have something to put in its place. That caused huge anxiety among those who depend on the United States and our defensive world order. President Trump went to NATO, but he was defiantly reluctant to affirm the core of NATO, the basis of it all, which was Article 5. Article 5, of course, provides that an attack on any single member of NATO is an attack on all of them. Do you know how many times Article 5 has been invoked in the history of NATO? Just once. And it was at 9/11 when we were attacked. The other NATO members came to our help and said, the attack on the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon is an attack on all of us. Article 5 is the heart of NATO. And when President Trump he went and didn't even say anything about it the first time. All he did was criticize people for not paying their full share of the burden of defense. He eventually was forced to say, yeah, okay, I'll go along with Article 5. But NATO members worried that NATO might not exist if the American president did not accept its most important provision. Secondly, their confidence was weakened when he proceeded to treat Putin and Xi of China and Kim Jong-un of North Korea more warmly than our Western allies. As a veteran of the intelligence community, I remember when President Trump and Putin met in Helsinki, and he was asked, the president was asked, do you agree with your own intelligence agencies that Russia tried to interfere in the election of 2016? Our intelligence agencies, all 16, had come to the conclusion with high confidence. High confidence means I know this liquor store was robbed because I came into it, saw the robber with a gun to the head of the person who owned it and taking the cash out of the cash. With high confidence means we have definite proof. And he said, no, he did not believe our intelligence agencies. He believed President Putin because Putin said he wouldn't do it, didn't do it. And as Trump said, I see no reason to disbelieve him. Well, that obviously did huge damage to NATO and to our own intelligence community. So what were the specific things that went against the international order by that administration? One was we quit the Paris Climate Accord on global warming. We were no longer a member. We quit the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that restricted Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons. We resigned from UNESCO. We resigned from the UN Human Rights Council. We quit the Open Skies Treaty. We abandoned the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. And perhaps extremely importantly, we resigned from and did not proceed with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a coalition of countries form an economic union, obviously to compete against China. So our allies are asked, they're nervous. Where do we stand now? Since the Ukraine war, things have come back together again. And the President Biden went over and immediately said, I'm glad to be with you here today. I support Article 5. Now, were those Trump years aberrations? Or was that a glimpse of what's going to come to the future? With the advent of the current president, have we returned to some kind of normalcy? Or is normalcy what preceded the current administration? One reputable poll in the summer of 2023, just a couple months ago, showed our division as a nation about support for Ukraine. 55% support are in favor of our support of Ukraine and the NATO effort. 45% are against it, almost evenly split, 10% more favor it. It's partisan as well, unfortunately. The World Affairs Council has always been either nonpartisan or bipartisan. But in that divide, 62% of Democrats favored continued support of Ukraine, and 71% of Republicans were against it. So on that very fundamental support for this international world order and its immediate crisis, we are a nation divided. Now, within the United States, if you ask people, the preponderance of support is for the international world order. We've supported it since the end of World War II, with some exceptions. And you're expected to have some exceptions in a democracy. But while we have difficulty agreeing on the future, there's a fairly strong consensus that we don't want to live in the kind of world that Russia has prescribed, or in China with a social index number, and cameras on every street corner monitoring what we do. This is not a new challenge. The world has been ruled far longer by authoritarians than it has by democracies. Democracy is still an experiment. both domestically as a form of government and as a leader of the world order. It's new in the great course of history. President Lincoln at Gettysburg raised the question as to whether our nation or any nation so dedicated and so conceived could long endure. And to that, we should add a challenge, a challenge that didn't exist at the time of our Civil War. Can we long endure and also lead an international world order when we have wavering consensus to do so? To endure, we need a few essentials: a commitment to democracy, a respect for differing views, the acceptance of the outcome of elections, and the will and confidence to work with our friends and to lead internationally. The burden also rests with intelligent leadership. The American consensus formed in World War II and managed afterwards is now well in the past. Wars without clear purpose have been fought and without adequate national support, which have weakened our adherence to the world order. I'm talking about Iraq and Vietnam, which did not have strong support and do not today. Afghanistan as well. These three wars divided Americans and left resentment that while our troops performed very well, our political leaders were held in doubt and were not given strong support. And the American public often look upon those three wars, being Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, with question, were they worth it? And thank goodness our political system allows for debate and invites dissent and controversy and course correction. We can be flexible in addressing these things in a way that authoritarian governments have not. So some summary thoughts to wrap this up. One is that instability brings conflict and suffering and war. We need to recognize the fragility of our democracy and to defend this experiment. We counter instability by making national security and leadership a domestic priority. History does not forgive ambiguity and complacency. I would urge we should not be afraid of engagement and leadership. If we don't provide it, who will? America has the potential to fight instability and to enhance global security. If the United States does play a special role in international relations, it has that role to play. If we ignore our international responsibilities, as we did between World War I and World War II, we invite disorder, wars, and chaos. That instability is why the World Affairs Councils in America were formed to combat isolationism and to foster a constructive role for the United States on the world stage. We talked about Chamberlain. In 1943, when Prime Minister Chamberlain's successor, Woodrow Wilson, spoke at Harvard, he spoke about the U.S. role in the world. And his famous quote there was, "The price of greatness is responsibility." Americans inherently do not want always to go beyond their borders and to do things elsewhere. But if we are a great nation, we have a responsibility to ensure that wars do not occur and to lead an international order based on principles that the rest of the world can share. Today's responsibility right now starts with, for example, helping Ukraine to defend itself. And it goes through sustaining and modernizing the world order we have created. Now, what I've talked about today is difficult. A lot of us would rather just stay at home, have businesses, enjoy our families, not get wrapped up in the affairs of the world. There's a burden to be paid for that, both in terms of people and lives and treasure. It's difficult. But when I think of things are difficult in the world, I think of that famous reporter, Edward R. Murrow, who covered World War II from London. And he had that famous quotation that I think applies to where the United States is today with regard to the international world order. It's difficult to maintain. And as Edward R. Murrow said, difficulty is the one excuse that history never accepts. And on that note, I hope I've provoked you a little bit, and I look forward to receiving questions.
Okay. Mr. House, thank you very, very much. If you folks want to unveil, I guess might be the right word, is so I really appreciate that. I know I've got a couple of questions, but I'm willing, if you've got a question, raise your hand and we'll get, I'm happy to call on you. Anybody know a little bit bashful, so I'll start. Um, what values, what American values and strategic interests, given your perspective, are worth it for us to go to war for, to risk American lives and treasure?
Well, it always starts with security. Is there a threat to American interests? And there are times in the world, Steve, when there are things going on which we do not like, but we cannot be the world's policeman. So if you have a very small country, uh, and there are a number of them that have dictators, as long as there's no genocide, as long as they're not killing people, suppose they don't have elections for 30 years. There are a lot of countries that don't. That does not mean that we need to go in and say you have to have elections. I think what we look at is when there are basic violations of human rights, or when our security or the security of our allies is threatened. Now, it's easy to see that when it does happen. When you have an invasion of another country, you could say that's not right. That has not happened in Europe, for example, since the end of World War II. And that's what made the invasion of Ukraine so blatant. And the Poles, the Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, they all looked up and said, wait a minute, if this is happening right on our doorstep, it could happen to us as well. So what we do not stand for is a blatant invasion of another country. An example is when Iraq went into Kuwait, and George H.W. Bush had the wisdom to throw them out and then to get out of it and not try to go in and establish a democracy in Iraq. He just did the limited warfare of saying, you cannot take over another country, and then left the scene. So I would say it's primarily when our national security is directly threatened or that of our allies. I think that we can agree on. Secondly, we do not want to be the policeman of the world. And when human conditions become so severe that we need to intervene, that's for discussion and debate.
Okay, anybody else? Questions? Don't see any hands. Come on, folks. I got a million of them, so, but I don't want to.
Well, that's good. That's good. I was trying to be provocative.
The is all right. I'll ask you one. Is all war bad?
No, all war is not bad. I think there are good. I think there are good wars. Look, I was born in 1942. In my family, uncles and so forth went to war. Why did they go to war? Because the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, had gone to war against us, and was at war in Asia. The Nazis had invaded Poland, Belgium, France, and were bombing the UK. We decided that we did not want to live in a world in which Japan and Asia, and that kind of Nazi aggression in Europe was sustainable, was going to prevail. And we thought it was worthwhile for us to go to war to prevent Nazism. And those who look at wars, this is neither good nor bad, what I'm about to say. Mankind, humanity, has never decided that peace, meaning the absence of standing up for basic human dignity, that it was worth not going to war. We have always defended protecting our families and our countries from brutal takeover. So the answer to your question is no, there are times when it is worthwhile to go to war. All wars, absolutely not. I mean, a border war between two small countries where we don't have a dog in the fight, I would urge them to find peace and I would help them find peace. But we do not have to go everywhere there's a conflict. But absolutely there are wars which are worth fighting. And I commended my own uncles for going and risking their lives to help prevent the Nazis from taking over Europe, for example.
Okay. Yes, question. That's you. Yep.
Yes. Can you comment on how you might see the Ukraine war folding out over the next months? Just us keep sending more and more arms, different kinds of armaments.
Sure.
just to bolster them up? Well, how do you see this ending and unfolding as we approach winter?
Margot, you asked two different questions. One was the next several months, and secondly was how do I see it ending? Let me answer the first one first. I don't see it changing much over the next several months. How will it end? It will end in some form of exhaustion on one side or the other. What kind of exhaustion do I mean? It could well be that the kind of statements that you're hearing on the floor of the House of Representatives right now, that this is not worth fighting. We should not be spending our treasure and sending armaments to another country like that. So if enough countries were to decide they were not going to support Ukraine with weaponry and ammunition and so forth, Ukraine would have to sue for a settlement. I don't think that Russia will ever be able to take over all of Ukraine. They are willing to fight and die to the last Ukrainian. So if support were to dry up, then you would have a predominantly Russian or a Russian-dominated part of the world with some small Ukraine existing. Secondly, it's not going well for Russia. The cost on their side is also extremely significant. They anticipated 3 days and then the folding of the country. They have lost an enormous number in dead and wounded. It is hurting their economy. There are internal pressures against Putin and a recent coup attempt. One scenario that is touted a lot amongst the U.S. defense and intelligence community is that this is just too big a price to bear. Remember, in the Afghanistan war that the Russians fought, after they had lost enough aircraft out of the sky because of our Stinger missiles, after they had lost enough people, after they saw they could not win, they finally said, this is not worth it. And they, having said they would never leave, they folded up and went away. Well, this war is not popular in Russia. You have conscripts. The Ukrainians are fighting their land, their families, their territory, their homes. Russians are being sent there to do that. And they have the full support of advanced weaponry from the West. Now, there are things coming on. You've seen the use of what's called ATACMS, which are 180-mile use of rockets. They have been extremely effective recently against the Russians. Secondly, you have F-16s, which will come in. And we continue to show the will to fight. So to answer both questions together, next couple of months, I don't see any major breakthroughs. If the United States and NATO continue to see this as a primary threat to the kind of world order we have stood for since World War II and continue to support Ukraine, I think you'll start to see disintegration in Crimea. I think the land bridge will be broken. And I think the cost to Russia will continue to mount so that at some point they will be the ones to say, all right, let's settle this, in which the outcome will be there may be some parts of Ukraine that remain in Russian hands, but the victory would be predominantly a Ukrainian one. I hope that answers.
I hope you're right. Thank you.
Okay. Sure.
Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to do it.
William Murray's hand is up.
Oh, all right. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to take us a little bit off of that topic. While the liberal world order and the United States' role in it is good and absolutely necessary, how do you think it could or should change to better integrate and deal with parts of the world that it hasn't in the past? And I'm thinking, Africa, South America, South Asia, places like that, where the world we're in now is definitely more integrated, and there's I think a lot more understanding of how that those places have been underserved, but I don't know that the world order itself and its organizations have changed much to deal with it.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And you cited some of the countries which deserve to have a greater role in it. Brazil, South Africa. I mean, Iran is one, but Iran does not want to join this world order. Basically, there has been a revision, for example, of the participation in the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which are based on the subscriptions of the countries. Now, simple at the UN. At the General Assembly, every country has a vote. Security Council, 5 countries have a veto. At the major international economic institutions, The amount of vote you have depends on how much you contribute to the World Bank and the IMF. So the United States has 17% of the votes. The UK has 8. France has about 6. And you put together Europe and the United States, and they dominate the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Now, both have provided security, monetary security. Both have helped to develop the rest of the world. But I think for one specific example, we need to look at the Brazils and the South Africas and other countries of the world and say, come on in, subscribe to this, take part in its governance, own it, tell us how you would like to have it changed. I think in terms of trade, I don't know what to do other than to be fair, to say that we will have trade agreements and we will seek to reduce tariffs as the basic as much as we possibly can. Most countries, as they develop, find that international trade stimulates their economy. Once they start to export, they make some money because they have a comparative advantage in things of a low wage content. We in the United States have basically thrived on that. You know, we don't make textiles anymore. We do make computers. We do artificial intelligence. We have arts and entertainment. We do high content, high intelligence involved things. Plus, we make a lot of equipment and manufactured goods that are made by robots. So that system does benefit other countries, but we got to make sure that they have a stake in it and see that it does. Part of the reason why they have not joined is that, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative that comes from China. China has pumped a lot of resources into Africa and Asia, building trains, building bridges. And when you have that kind of money coming in, very often your opposition to the international world order is not because of its rules or how the system works, but because you have received an awful lot of money from the country which opposes it, which is China. So those are a few observations. Your question, though, Mr. Murray, is absolutely vital. This setup basically was created in 1948. I mean, it's 80 years old, 70, 80 years old, and it needs to be revised. Plus, when we had a president who said, I don't like it, I don't give a damn, there was nothing he could find to replace it with. So we need new answers, some of which would be greater inclusion, some of which would be greater voting rights, and others would be clear economic opportunity to enjoy the fruits of the trade and investment systems that have been made available. So I think that's a starting point. But clearly, we've got to do something, because something that old without revision will start to look fragile if we don't change it.
Okay, any other questions? I'll ask one more. You talked about the domestic political divisions in our country. Over the long term, how does a democracy like America that is deeply divided compete with autocracies that are not? And especially when policies of containment that we used to try probably won't work anymore.
Well, that last one threw a little wrench in it. Let me take it up to that point, Steve, and then add that on. Autocracies have an advantage in that it doesn't matter that a lot of people in your country don't support what you do. They can't change it. So when somebody, if the Russians or the Chinese or Iran or North Korea wants to do something, it doesn't matter that only 20% of that country supports it. It's going to get done anyway because it wants to get done, and dissent and repression are not tolerated. So they got the advantage in that sense. In the United States, I honestly don't know the answer as to whether our lack of consensus on a positive international role is a product of our political dissent, or whether our political dissent causes this division. In other words, if you don't agree with what's going on, are you going to go out and just find things to disagree on? And sometimes I think, that seems to be what's going on. I just reject everything that's going on because I don't like you and I don't like the other guy. So what the other guy is for, I'm against. Secondly, it's very easy, it always has been, to say, why are you spending your money on a strong defense, on helping our allies, on fighting a war, when you could be spending that money on, and then fill in the blank. Hundreds of things: better education, support for our border, greater social security, enhancing our healthcare system. I mean, you know, taking care of our critical infrastructure, better airports, railroad systems that are modernized. You know, there's all kinds of things that you could be spending your money on, or other than being a world power. And I just don't know. I think, first of all, we have to talk to each other and listen to each other. Um, you know, I worked in the Senate. I was the chief of staff to the Senate Majority Leader for several years, and I worked for Senator Abe Ribicoff of Connecticut. There was a decorum there. And if I disagreed with you, Steve, and we were on the floor of the Senate, two things would pertain. One is, I would think you're wrong, but I would address the chair, and I would say, I think the honorable colleague, Mr. Spellman, does not thoroughly appreciate some of the reasons why I am proposing this. Now, I would call you the honorable gentleman from Massachusetts, and I would address the chair. I would not say, you dumb SOB, you don't know what you're talking about. Why? Because there was respect in the first place. And secondly, next week there's another bill coming up, and I need your support on the other bill that's coming up. So no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, but you deal with each other in a way in which you can always come back and say, Steve, we disagreed on that one this week. I'm sorry about that. Difference of views, and I got that. Now, here's something that's coming up next month, and I think it's really critical to our country. Can we get together and talk about it? Can we agree on it? That kind of dialogue, that kind of discussion about what is really right for the United States is what has taken such a huge hit. And when people don't talk, they talk past each other. They don't seek consensus. And in fact, when the word bipartisanship and finding consensus and collaboration becomes an evil word, an evil phraseology that could bring a primary opponent against you, that's a domestic disease that we have. And I think we really have to realize that partisanship has its limits. The other party is not the enemy. The enemy is our inability to get things done together. So the latter part of your question, I guess, where does all this lead? I am disappointed that we take the positive role that the United States has been engaged in, basically positive. Some wars I wish we hadn't fought, some things I wish we hadn't done, but basically have led a rather peaceful world order since the end of World War II, based on partisanship. I yearn for the days when the Republican Party was the party of business, of limited government, and of international engagement. The Rockefeller Republicans were. And they could get together with the more conservative Democrats and talk about what is right for the country, rather than seeing whatever comes out of the mouths of the opposition as evil, and therefore I have to draw a line in the sand and oppose it. I think that's the poison. That's why I linked it to Abraham Lincoln. Can we long endure, not only as a democracy, but as a constructive force in the world order? Sorry if I got a little bit excited about that.
That's what we like. We like that excitement here, Mr. Excitement. I don't see anything else. Sid, do you have anything?
Well, thank you very much, Art House. I've been trying to get him up here in person for a number of years, and I'm actually going to try to get him up here in person within the next year or so. We've already talked about this a couple of times. So thank you very much, Art.
I accept the invitation, Sid, and I'll leave you all with just saying God bless you for being part of the World Affairs Council. There's nothing that could make the world a much better place than to have more people like you with good programs. So thanks for inviting me, and I'd be glad to come back in person.
Excellent. So thank you again to everybody who has attended. I will remind you that our next program will be on November 30th, an instant issues lunch with Konstantin Pleshikov on Putin's waiting game.